Elias stood in the middle of the bustling police precinct, listening to the chaotic noise of phones ringing and officers shouting over one another. To look at him, you would think he was perfect for the job. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a strong jaw that looked like it belonged on a movie poster. He wore the uniform with pride, the badge shining bright on his chest. But inside, Elias felt like he didn't belong. While the other officers joked loudly about catching bad guys and talked about the streets like a war zone, Elias stayed quiet. He didn't see the city as a battlefield, he saw it as a place full of people who were just having a really bad day. The problem wasn't that Elias wasn't brave. He would run into a burning building without thinking twice. The problem was his heart. He had too much empathy for a job that often required a stone-cold attitude. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Elias and his partner, a veteran officer named Officer Miller, responded to a call about a domestic disturbance. These calls were usually the worst. They were unpredictable and often turned violent. When they arrived at a small, run-down apartment, the door was already open. Inside, a young man was pacing around the living room, looking frantic, while a woman sat on the sofa crying, holding a young child. Miller immediately put his hand on his baton, his face hardening. He stepped forward, his voice loud and commanding, shouting at the man to get on the ground. The young man looked terrified, freezing in place like a deer in headlights. He wasn't holding a weapon, he was just holding his head in his hands, looking like he was about to collapse. But Elias saw something different. He didn't see a threat. He saw a man who had reached his breaking point. Elias gently stepped past Miller and signaled for him to wait. He lowered his voice, speaking softly, the way you would talk to a scared dog. "Hey," Elias said calmly, holding his hands up openly. "It looks like you're having a really hard time. We just want to make sure everyone is okay." The young man looked up, surprised by the gentle tone. Instead of getting aggressive, he started talking. He poured out his heart about losing his job, the rent being overdue, and the pressure crushing him. Elias listened. He didn't reach for handcuffs. He nodded. He told the man he understood how tough things could get. Within 20 minutes, the situation was completely de-escalated. The man was sitting on the floor, apologizing to his wife. Elias spent another hour on his phone, actually calling a local shelter and a food bank to get the family the help they needed. He even helped them fill out the paperwork. When they finally got back to the patrol car, Miller was furious. He slammed the door shut and looked at Elias with disgust. "You're not a social worker, Elias," Miller snapped. "You're a cop. That guy should have been in handcuffs. You wasted an hour of patrol time playing therapist. You can't save everyone." Elias just looked out the window, watching the rain fall on the sidewalk. He knew Miller was technically right by the book, but it didn't feel wrong to him. He knew that if they had arrested that man, the family would have lost their home for sure. Instead, they had a chance. A few days later, Elias was on foot patrol near the market. It was a cold, windy afternoon. He saw an older man, clearly homeless, trying to sneak a sandwich out of a grocery store. The store owner was shouting at him, waving his arms, and a crowd was starting to gather. Elias walked over. Usually, this would be a straightforward arrest for shoplifting. He could have grabbed the man, cuffed him, and taken him to the station. It would have been the easy thing to do. But when Elias looked at the old man, he saw his grandfather. He saw someone who was just hungry and cold. Elias asked the store owner if he could handle it. Reluctantly, the owner agreed. Elias took the man aside. Instead of scolding him, Elias asked him when was the last time he ate. The man mumbled that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. He took the man to a nearby deli, sat him down, and bought him a hot meal and a coffee. He sat with him while he ate, treating him with dignity and respect. He didn't write a ticket. He didn't make an arrest. He just made sure a human being had food in his belly. Unfortunately for Elias, Sergeant Miller was watching from down the street. When Elias returned to the precinct that evening, the mood was heavy. Sergeant Miller called him into his office immediately. The office smelled like stale coffee and old paper. The sergeant sat behind his desk, looking tired and annoyed. He didn't invite Elias to sit down. "Listen to me, Elias," Miller said, rubbing his temples. "We have a problem here. I've been watching your reports. You have the lowest arrest rate in the entire precinct. You let people go with warnings. You buy lunch for thieves. You counsel domestic abusers." Elias stood up straight, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sergeant, I didn't feel like arresting that old man was going to help anyone. He was hungry. And the family the other day, they just needed resources, not a jail cell." Miller slammed his hand on the desk. "This isn't about what you feel. This is about law and order. You are wearing a badge, not a heart on your sleeve. You are supposed to enforce the law. You are too friendly, Elias. You are too nice. Being nice doesn't stop criminals. Being nice gets you or your partner killed." The words stung more than Elias expected. He had always thought being a good cop meant protecting the community, even if that meant protecting people from themselves sometimes. "Son," Miller continued, his voice softening just a fraction, but staying firm. "You are a good man. You really are. But you are not cut out to be a police officer. Not in this city. You don't have the instinct to be tough when it counts. You are too friendly for the police." Elias left the office that day with a heavy choice. He wasn't fired, not officially, but he was put on a probation that basically told him he had to change who he was or leave. He spent the weekend staring at his ceiling. He loved helping people. He loved serving his city. But he knew he couldn't be the aggressive, stone-faced officer the sergeant wanted him to be. That wasn't him. On Monday morning, Elias walked into the precinct for the last time. He took off his badge and placed it on the desk, along with his gun belt. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He felt like a failure. He felt like he had let everyone down. He drifted into the world of private security. It wasn't glamorous. Most of the time, he was guarding empty warehouses at night or sitting in a booth at the entrance of a parking lot, checking IDs. It was boring, quiet work. No one expected him to save the world here. They just expected him to watch a gate. For a few months, Elias just went through the motions. He felt like his talent for empathy was useless. He thought he was washed up, a guy who was too nice for the real world. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to take a turn that was stranger than fiction. He didn't know that being too friendly was exactly the special skill that a very famous, mysterious person was looking for. He just sat in his little security booth, drinking lukewarm coffee, thinking his story was over, when it was actually just beginning. Months passed by in a blurry routine of night shifts and quiet parking lots. After leaving the police force, Elias found himself working as a security guard for a large, self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the adrenaline and noise of the precinct. Most nights, The only excitement was a stray cat knocking over a trash can or a customer forgetting their gate code. Elias spent his hours sitting in a small, glass-walled booth, watching the rain slide down the windows and drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos. He tried to be content. He told himself that at least here, nobody was yelling at him for being too nice, and nobody was asking him to hurt anyone. But deep down, Elias felt a heavy knot of failure in his chest. He had dedicated years of his life to becoming a police officer, only to be told that his best quality, his kindness, was actually a flaw. He felt like a race car driver who was disqualified for driving too safely. He wondered if he would ever find a place where he fit in, or if he would just fade away into the background of these quiet, empty parking lots forever. Then, on a Tuesday morning that started just like any other, Elias's phone buzzed with an email notification. He expected it to be a bill or a spam message, but the subject line made him pause. It read, "Confidential inquiry regarding your profile." The sender was an agency called Vanguard Personal Protection. Elias had never heard of them. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the delete button, but curiosity got the better of him. He opened the email. The message was short and professional. It stated that they had come across his resume from a law enforcement database and were impressed by his background. They wanted to know if he was available for a consultation regarding a unique private security contract. Elias stared at the screen, confused. He hadn't applied for any jobs. His profile on the job board was bare bones and hadn't been updated in months. Why would a high-end agency be looking at a guy who got pushed out of the police force for being too soft? He almost dismissed it as a mistake, but something in the wording "unique contract" stuck with him. With nothing to lose, he typed out a polite reply asking for more information. 2 days later, his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Ms. Clark. She didn't give many details over the phone. She simply asked if he could come to their downtown office for an interview the following morning. The address was in the financial district, a part of the city filled with skyscrapers and people in expensive suits. Elias felt out of place just thinking about it. He dug out his only good suit, a dark navy one he hadn't worn since his graduation from the academy, and hoped it still fit. The next morning, Elias stood in front of a sleek glass building that towered over the street. He took a deep breath, smoothed down his tie, and walked inside. The lobby was pristine, smelling of lemon polish and fresh coffee. He took the elevator up to the 30th floor, his nerves growing with every number that lit up on the display. When the door slid open, he was greeted by a receptionist who led him down a long, silent hallway to a corner office. Ms. Clark was sitting behind a large mahogany desk. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't smile when Elias walked in, but she waved a hand toward the chair opposite her. Elias sat down, feeling small in the big leather chair. He clasped his hands in his lap to stop them from shaking. "Thank you for coming, Elias," Ms. Clark said, looking down at a folder in front of her. "I've reviewed your file from the police department. It's interesting reading." Elias's stomach dropped. He knew what was in that file. The reprimands for not making enough arrests. The note from Sergeant Miller about him being too friendly. He decided to be honest rather than try to hide it. "I appreciate you seeing me," Elias started, his voice a little shaky. "But I have to be honest with you. I'm not sure why I'm here. The police force let me go because I wasn't aggressive enough. I don't have a background in high-risk security or combat tactics. I'm really just a regular guy who tried to help people." Ms. Clark looked up over her glasses. For the first time, a small, Knowing smile played on her lips. I am aware of your history with the police, Elias. In fact, that is exactly why you are here. We didn't look for you because of how many people you arrested. We looked for you because of how you handled the situations you didn't arrest people for. Elias blinked, completely confused. I don't understand. Ms. Clark leaned forward, clasping her hands together. Our agency handles protection for very high-profile individuals. Usually, that means we hire guys who look like they could crush a car with their bare hands. But, we have a new client. A very special client. He is currently in the city for a project that requires him to spend a lot of time in public spaces. He hates the usual celebrity entourage. He refuses to be surrounded by giant men in black suits with earpieces shouting at people to get back. He finds it intimidating and impersonal. He wants something different. She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. He wants a protection detail that is low profile. He wants someone who can blend into a crowd. Someone who doesn't look like a threat. Specifically, he needs someone who can de-escalate a situation using words and empathy rather than force. He told me, find me someone who looks like they wouldn't hurt a fly, but who would stand in front of a train to keep me safe. Elias sat back in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. It sounded too good to be true. For years, his softness had been his weakness. Now, this woman was telling him it might be his greatest strength. So, the job, Elias asked slowly, is to be a bodyguard, but a nice one. Precisely, Ms. Clark nodded. It's a temporary assignment, but it is high stakes. The client values privacy above all else. If you take this job, you will be by his side constantly. You will have to read the room, you will have to talk to strangers, and you will have to keep him safe without anyone realizing you are doing it. Why me? Elias asked. There must be hundreds of people with more experience. Because you are genuine, Ms. Clark said simply. Your reports showed that you actually care. In this line of work, trust is hard to come by. My client trusts his gut, and his gut told him to look for someone like you. She slid a thick envelope across the desk. Here is the contract. The pay is significantly more than you made at the storage facility, or even at the precinct. But there is a catch. You cannot tell anyone who you are protecting. You have to sign a non-disclosure agreement right now if you are interested. And if you accept, you start tomorrow. Elias picked up the envelope. It felt heavy in his hand. His mind was racing with questions. Who was this client? A politician, a tech billionaire? Why would a famous person trust a failed rookie cop with their life? It was risky. It was completely outside his comfort zone. But looking at Ms. Clark, he realized he didn't have a choice. He didn't want to go back to the storage booth. He didn't want to give up on his dream of being useful. He wanted to prove that his way of doing things mattered. He reached into his jacket pocket for a pen. I'm in, he said. Ms. Clark's smile widened. She opened a drawer and pulled out a separate, black folder. Excellent. There is one more thing you should know before we finalize. This client isn't just any celebrity. He is unique. You might find him a bit strange. But if you give him the same respect you gave the families on your beat, you two will get along just fine. Elias signed the papers, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs. He had no idea who he had just agreed to protect, or where this mysterious assignment would take him. He only knew that his boring, quiet life was over. As he walked out of the building and into the busy city street, he felt a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. He was ready for the mystery. The following morning began with a confusing itinerary. Elias received a text message instructing him to go to a small private airfield on the edge of the city. There was no mention of a destination, just a flight time and a gate number. He felt a mix of nervous energy and skepticism. Was this actually a job, or was he being sent on a wild goose chase? He packed a small bag with a couple of changes of clothes, his toothbrush, and the lucky pen he used to sign the contract. Standing on the tarmac, the wind whipping his jacket, he watched a sleek, unmarked jet land smoothly on the runway. He climbed aboard the plane, expecting to find a team of people, but he was the only passenger. The flight lasted just under 2 hours. When they finally descended, Elias looked out the window and saw mountains. Lots of them. They had landed near a remote town that looked like it was mostly made of log cabins and pine trees. A black SUV was waiting for him on the runway. The driver was a silent woman who didn't introduce herself, she simply nodded for him to get in. They drove for another 40 minutes, winding through narrow roads that were surrounded by dense forests. Elias's mind was racing with possibilities. Was he meeting a reclusive author, a politician hiding out? The farther they got from civilization, the more isolated and strange the whole situation felt. Finally, the SUV turned onto a gravel driveway and pulled up in front of a large, modern house that seemed to grow right out of the side of a mountain. It was beautiful, but very private. Go to the front door. They're waiting for you, the driver said, finally breaking the silence. Elias grabbed his bag and walked up the wooden steps to the massive front door. Before he could even knock, it swung open. Standing there wasn't Ms. Clark, and it wasn't a butler. It was a man dressed in simple gray sweatpants and a t-shirt. He was holding a mug of coffee. He looked familiar, but in this setting, so far away from movie theaters and billboards, Elias's brain couldn't immediately place him. The man smiled, a warm and easy smile that reached his eyes. He held out a hand. Hey. You must be Elias. I'm Keanu. It took Elias a solid 5 seconds to actually process the name. He shook the hand, which felt strong and calloused, not soft like he might have expected. Then, his brain finally clicked into place. The jawline. The nose. The voice. He was standing in front of Keanu Reeves? The action star. The guy from the action movies everyone watched. Elias felt his knees go a little weak. He tried to compose himself, remembering that he was here to do a job, even if the job was protecting a global superstar. Yes. Hi. Mr. Reeves? I mean, Keanu, Elias stammered. It's an honor to meet you. Keanu laughed softly and stepped aside, waving him into the house. Please, come in. No need to be formal. We're going to be spending a lot of time together, so Keanu is perfect. The inside of the house was comfortable and lived in. There were guitar stands in the corner and books stacked everywhere. It didn't feel like a museum, it felt like a home. Keanu led him to a large living room with a wall of windows overlooking the mountains. They sat down on a sofa facing a stone fireplace. Keanu offered him a cup of tea, which Elias accepted gratefully to calm his nerves. So, Keanu started, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked Elias directly in the eyes, his expression serious but kind. Ms. Clark told me a bit about why you left the police force. She told me they said you were too friendly. Elias felt a familiar pang of embarrassment. He looked down at his hands. Yeah, that's pretty much the summary. I couldn't turn off the empathy part of my brain. The sergeant said I was more of a social worker than a cop. I guess I just didn't have the killer instinct they wanted. Keanu nodded slowly. That is exactly why I picked your file. I've worked with a lot of security guys in the past. Big guys. Tough guys. And they are great at what they do if there is an attacker or a mob to fight off. But I'm working on something different right now. Keanu stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the trees. I'm preparing for a new film. It's a gritty, realistic role. I need to understand the pulse of the city. I need to walk through rough neighborhoods, visit homeless shelters, go into dive bars, and talk to real people on the street. I need to disappear into a crowd to do my research properly. But every time I try to do that with my usual security team, it becomes a circus. 4 giant men in black suits surround me, and suddenly nobody is acting real anymore. They either want to take a selfie, or they get scared and run away. I can't see the truth when I'm surrounded by a wall of muscle. He turned back to face Elias. I don't need a wall, Elias. I need a shadow. I need someone who can blend in. Someone who looks like a regular guy having a coffee, and most importantly, if we get into a sticky situation, I don't want someone who is going to throw a punch the second someone raises their voice. That escalates everything. I want someone who can talk. Someone who can de-escalate. Someone who can read the room and handle things with a smile rather than a fight. Elias sat up straighter. For the first time in his life, his flaws were being described as skills. It was a surreal feeling. The very things that got him fired, his patience, his calm nature, his ability to talk to people, were exactly what this man needed. I can do that, Elias said, his voice gaining confidence. I'm good at reading people. I know how to make someone feel heard so they calm down. And I promise you, I can be invisible. I'm not looking for fame or trouble. I know you can, Keanu said, sitting back down. I read the report about the domestic dispute where you spent an hour helping that family instead of arresting the husband. And the story about the homeless man you bought lunch for. That's the kind of power I need. The power of kindness. Keanu reached over to a side table and picked up a thick stack of papers. It was a schedule and a map. We start tomorrow. We aren't staying here. We're heading back to the city. We're going to walk through some neighborhoods that can be pretty rough. We're going to take the subway. We're going to eat at street carts. I need to be invisible. But I also need to know that if someone recognizes me and gets aggressive, you're there to handle it with that too friendly attitude of yours. Elias looked at the map, then at Keanu. He realized this wasn't just a bodyguard job. This was a partnership. Keanu wasn't treating him like an employee or a hired muscle, he was treating him like a crucial partner in this creative journey. I'm ready, Elias said. He meant it. The anxiety he felt on the plane was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. He wasn't a failed cop anymore. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Good, Keanu smiled, picking up his coffee mug. Get some rest tonight, Elias. Tomorrow, the real work begins. And hey, pack light. We move fast. As Elias walked to the guest room that night, he looked out the window at the moon rising over the mountains. He thought about how strange life was. A few months ago, he was a uniform nobody couldn't wait to get rid of. Now, he was drinking tea with a movie star, preparing to protect him with nothing more than his words and his instincts. It felt like a movie plot itself, but as he lay down on the bed, he knew it was real. And he was ready to prove that kindness could be the strongest armor of all. The bright morning sun over the mountains quickly faded into the gray haze of the city as the private plane touched down on the runway. The contrast between the quiet, peaceful retreat and the concrete jungle was jarring. Elias felt the shift in the air immediately. It was thicker, louder, and smelled of exhaust and damp asphalt. He wasn't just a security guard anymore, he was the personal shield for one of the most famous men on the planet, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders. Keanu didn't want the usual arrival routine. There were no black SUVs waiting on the tarmac, no screaming fans held back by barricades. Instead, they walked out of the private terminal like two regular guys catching a flight. Keanu wore a worn-out baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, a simple hoodie, and jeans that had seen better days. Elias dressed similarly, trying his best to look like just another friend walking alongside him. The plan was simple but terrifying: take the subway into the city center and then walk to a specific neighborhood that was known for being tough and unforgiving. As they descended into the subway station, Elias's senses were on high alert. His police training kicked in automatically. He scanned the crowd, looking for threats, watching hands in pockets, analyzing body language. But this time, he had to fight the urge to stand in front of Keanu or push people away. He had to stay relaxed, to look like he belonged. It was a mental balancing act that made his palms sweat. When the train screeched to a halt and the doors opened, the car was packed. People were tired, glued to their phones, or staring blankly at the advertisements. No one really noticed them. A few people glanced up at Keanu, perhaps thinking he looked familiar, but then quickly looked away, dismissing the thought. Why would a movie star be standing on a dirty train holding a handrail? The anonymity was exactly what Keanu wanted. They rode for 20 minutes, bumping shoulders with commuters, and emerged onto a street that was buzzing with energy. This part of the city was different from the tourist spots. It was a neighborhood of corner stores, barred windows, and loud music coming from passing cars. The sidewalks were crowded with people who had nowhere else to be. Elias walked a half step behind Keanu and slightly to the right, his hands loose and ready at his sides. They spent the next few hours just wandering. Keanu stopped to look at graffiti art, watched a game of basketball in a park, and bought a bag of fruit from a street vendor. He was absorbing the vibe of the place for his role. The real test came as the sun began to set. They turned down a narrower street, looking for a specific dive bar that Keanu wanted to visit. The street lights flickered, and the mood shifted. A group of young men, maybe 5 or 6 of them, were hanging out in front of a boarded-up storefront. They were loud, laughing, and drinking from bottles wrapped in brown paper. As Elias and Keanu approached, the laughter died down. One of the guys, a tall man wearing a heavy coat, nudged his friend and pointed at Keanu. "Yo, isn't that guy?" the tall one sneered, stepping out into the middle of the sidewalk to block their path. "The movie guy, the one that fights everyone." Elias's heart jumped into his throat. This was the moment every bodyguard dreads. The situation had instantly turned from observation to confrontation. The group closed in around them, forming a semicircle. They weren't violent yet, but they were posturing, puffing out their chests, looking for a reaction. A typical security team would have immediately stepped in, chest bumped the aggressors, and shouted for them to back off. But Elias knew that would only turn this into a fight, and a fight on these streets could get ugly fast. Elias didn't reach for a weapon or shout. He didn't even harden his expression. Instead, he stepped smoothly forward, placing himself gently between Keanu and the tall man. But he didn't do it in a threatening way. He held his hands up, palms open, in a gesture of peace, not war. "Hey, guys, how's it going tonight?" Elias said, his voice calm and friendly, like he was greeting neighbors at a barbecue. The tall man looked confused. He had been expecting aggression, not a warm welcome. He looked Elias up and down, trying to figure out the angle. "We're just chilling," the man said, his tone losing a fraction of its edge. "Who are you?" "Just a friend taking a walk," Elias said with a genuine smile. "We were actually looking for a place to grab a drink. Is this bar down the street any good, or is there somewhere else you guys would recommend?" The question caught them off guard. Elias was treating them with respect, asking for their local knowledge. He was validating them as the kings of this block rather than treating them like threats. The dynamic shifted instantly. The tension that was crackling in the air like static electricity began to dissipate. One of the other guys in the back, a younger guy wearing a beanie, laughed. "That bar nah, it's a dump. The drinks are watered down. You want a real drink, you gotta go to Tony's 2 blocks over." Elias turned to the beanie-wearing guy, nodding appreciatively. "Tony's, 2 blocks. Thanks, man. I appreciate the tip. We don't want to end up somewhere trashy." The tall man, realizing that he wasn't going to get a rise out of them, relaxed his shoulders. He actually smiled a little. "Yeah, stay away from here. It gets rough later. You guys be safe." "You too," Elias said, nodding at him. He gently motioned for Keanu to keep walking, and they continued past the group. Once they were about 50 yards down the street and safely out of earshot, Keanu let out a long breath. He looked at Elias with a look of pure amazement. "That was incredible," Keanu whispered. "I was bracing myself for a punch. That guy was huge. But you just talked to him." Elias smiled, keeping his eyes scanning the street ahead. "They didn't want to fight, Keanu. They just wanted to be seen. If I had pushed him, he would have pushed back, and then we'd have a brawl on our hands. People don't punch you if you're asking them for advice on where to get a beer. It's hard to be mad at someone who treats you like you matter." Keanu shook his head. "I've seen guys with years of special forces training handle situations worse than that. You didn't use force. You used humanity." "It's all I know," Elias replied simply. "People just want to be respected." They continued their walk for another hour, visiting the recommended bar and enjoying a drink in peace. The patrons at Tony's were a rough crowd, but with Elias leading the way, buying a round of drinks for the house and chatting with the bartender about the local sports team, they were welcomed warmly. No one bothered Keanu because, in Elias's presence, Keanu became just another friend of the community. Later that night, as they sat in a quiet booth eating cheeseburgers, Keanu put down his food and looked at Elias seriously. "You know, when I asked Ms. Clark for someone too friendly, I was taking a risk," Keanu admitted. "I wasn't sure if such a person could actually keep me safe. But watching you today, I realized that real protection isn't about walls. It's about bridges. You build a bridge to people so they don't want to cross you." Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the food. For so long, he had felt inadequate because he wasn't the tough, aggressive cop he thought he was supposed to be. Tonight, he realized that his nature wasn't a weakness. It was a superpower. He had navigated the tensest street in the city without a single hand being raised in anger, all by using the one weapon the police force told him to leave behind, his kindness. As they left the restaurant to head back to the hotel, the city lights reflected in the puddles on the ground. The streets still had danger, and the city was still chaotic, but Elias walked with a new confidence. He knew he could handle whatever came next, not by fighting the world, but by understanding it. The final days of the assignment passed in a blur of movement, but the vibe was completely different from the start. They moved through the city like ghosts, unnoticed and peaceful. Elias had mastered the art of being present without being intrusive. Whether they were walking through a crowded market or sitting on a park bench watching squirrels, Elias kept a watchful but gentle eye on everything. He handled a few more minor situations: a photographer who got too pushy, a drunk fan who wanted a hug at 2 a.m. using the same soft, respectful approach. He never raised his voice. He never used force. And every time, the situation dissolved into nothingness. On the last morning, they stood on the tarmac where it had all begun just a week ago. The private jet was waiting, its engines humming softly, ready to take Keanu to his next film set. The air was crisp and cool. It felt strange to Elias that this intense, life-changing experience was already over. He assumed he would just go back to the storage facility and his quiet, lonely life. Keanu turned to him, adjusting his backpack. He looked tired but happy, the kind of contentment that comes from a job well done. "I want to say thank you, Elias," Keanu said, extending his hand. "I haven't been able to walk around a city like a normal person in 10 years. You gave that back to me. The research for this movie is going to be 100 times better because of you." Elias shook his hand, feeling a bit sad. "It was an honor, Keanu. Honestly, I was just glad to be helpful." "You were more than helpful," Keanu insisted. He let go of the hand and looked Elias in the eye. "I've worked with ex-special forces guys, FBI agents, mercenaries, you name it. They are good at making walls. You are good at making bridges. And I realized something this week. I don't want to go back to the walls." Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, just a name and a number. "I'm starting a new production project next year. It's going to involve a lot of travel, a lot of strange places, and a lot of time in the public eye. I need a head of my personal security. Not a soldier. A partner. Someone who sees people the way you do." He held the card out to Elias. "I know you have a life back here, and I can't promise it will be easy. But I want you to think about coming with me. Full time. Your salary would be triple what you made at the storage facility. But more importantly, you'd be doing work that actually fits who you are." Elias looked at the card. His mind was racing. A week ago, he was a guy who couldn't even keep a job as a police officer because he was too soft. Now, one of the most famous actors in the world was asking him to be his right-hand man. It felt like the universe was finally correcting a mistake. He remembered the dark days in the security booth, feeling like his empathy was a curse. Standing here, he realized it was actually his greatest gift. "I don't need to think about it," Elias said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'd love to." Keanu grinned and slapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Get your bag. Let's go get some coffee before I take off." As Elias walked toward the plane, he felt a strange sensation. It was the weight of the police badge he used to wear, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like he had dropped a burden he had been carrying for years. He wasn't a failed cop. He wasn't a reject. He was a protector, just a different kind than the world usually sees. The story didn't end with a big explosion or a fight scene. It ended with two men sitting on the steps of a private plane, drinking coffee and talking about music. But for Elias, It was the perfect ending. He realized that society often mistakes kindness for weakness. It tells us that to be strong, we have to be hard, unyielding, and aggressive. But looking at Keanu, a man who had everything but chose to surround himself with gentleness, Elias saw the truth. Real strength is having the power to hurt someone but choosing to help them instead. Real strength is having the courage to be kind in a world that expects you to be cruel. When they finally said goodbye, Elias walked back to his car alone, but he didn't feel lonely. He drove through the city, passing the police precinct he used to work at. He saw Sergeant Miller standing outside, smoking a cigarette. For a second, Elias felt a flash of anger, remembering the words too friendly for the police. But then, he just smiled and waved. He didn't stop. He drove on to his small apartment to pack his things. He was leaving the storage facility behind. He was leaving the doubt behind. He had found a place where his heart was an asset, not a liability. As he folded his clothes into a suitcase, he realized that this wasn't just a job offer, it was a validation of his entire character. He was exactly who he was supposed to be. And somewhere out there, in the vast, busy world, there were probably other people just like him, people who felt too soft, too caring, too weird for their jobs. He hoped they would find their Keanu too. He hoped they would realize that you don't have to change your shape to fit into a puzzle piece that doesn't match. Sometimes, you just have to wait until the right picture comes along. Elias zipped up his bag, took one last look at his quiet, empty room, and turned off the light. He was ready for the next chapter. The mysterious assignment was over, but the real adventure was just beginning. He walked out the door, not with a scowl, but with a friendly smile, ready to take on the world, one kind word at a time.